Brother's obsessive girlfriend started stalking our family after he broke up with her, so we called the cops. My brother's girlfriend Jess was always a controlling pathological liar who loved to stir up drama and tell him what he could or could not do. When my brother came home from her party with a black eye and a welt on his cheek, I immediately knew she was somehow involved. I asked him what happened, and he responded, "I got in a fight. I might." This immediately raised suspicion, as my brother was as far from the fighting type as you could be. "A fight over what?" I asked. "Jess," he said simply, and went to his room. The next morning, he was driving me to my soccer game, and I pried again about what had happened. He didn't answer at first, but then said, "Jess is kind of weird. She likes to start things." I ended up getting it out of my brother that the night at the party, Jess had told my brother that another man at the party had attempted to rope her. My brother, being the man he is, confronted him and he said, "I've never even seen her before." And a fight started over the accusation. On the car ride home, Jess said that my brother must have misinterpreted her words, and that nothing close to rope had occurred. The lying seemed to be a detrimental bump in the road, and my brother broke things off. After several weeks, Jess contacted me asking if I wanted to go shopping with her. For some reason, I agreed. The day started pleasantly. Jess caught me up on her life and asked how I was, how my family and brother were. Nothing seemed strange, until she began to bring up uncomfortable conversation. She explained to me that she had had a sexually traumatic childhood, and that's why she lied so much. But she also aggressively defended herself, saying, "Whatever your brother told you was a lie. He was the one telling lies. That's why I had to break up with him." She seemed to jerk around the conversation from normal to deeply personal and strange topics. She explained in detail a lesbian experience she had had after ending her relationship with my brother, and told me that I should try it. I became increasingly uncomfortable with the conversation. She noticed and immediately apologized, saying that she really liked being my friend, and that she loved my brother, and that's why she was acting so crazy. I told her I liked being her friend too, and that I understood her feelings. This was a mistake. This is when the phone calls began. It started with just one. She called me a week after we had hung out at 10 p.m. She was sobbing and saying that she was so sad without my brother, and that she needed to get him back. Then they happened nightly. Later and later each time, I'd be dead asleep at 2 a.m. and receive a sobbing, hysterical, and desperate phone call. I felt so much pity for her that I continued to answer. One call was different than the other though. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't crying. I picked up the phone at 1:30 in the morning and heard a level-voiced, monotone Jess. She said one sentence, "Tell your brother I'm going to take my life tonight." And then she hung up. I felt numb. I had never experienced that before. No one I knew had ever behaved that way. I texted her over and over again asking if she was okay, and telling her to not do anything. I panicked. I thought I had done something wrong, and that since she told me I would be responsible in some way. The next day, I told my brother what had happened, and he said he'd go to. A week later, Jess arrived at my house, arm in arm with my brother. They had gotten back together and seemed as if nothing had happened. She smiled at me and never once mentioned the phone calls she had made to me. The next month is when things escalated again. I came home from school to my entire family sitting in the living room. They told me to sit down. I thought someone had died. My mother told me, "Your brother let us know how you're feeling." I had no idea what they were talking about. "Feeling?" I asked. My brother looked at me with pity in his eyes. "Jess told me that she wasn't the one who called you. You called her, and you're the one who wasn't feeling well." "What the F? No, that's not what happened. She called me every night for 2 weeks crying and saying she wanted you back." "That's not what she said. She said that you called her with your problems and that she wasn't sure what to do." I was immediately angry that her lies were continuing and that my own family believed them enough to stage an intervention. I showed them the text messages she'd sent me, played them voice messages, and showed my call history. That put an end to that lie. After that, I wanted nothing to do with her. My brother broke up with her again. She called him hundreds of times and sent hundreds of messages. She showed up at our house a few times with baked goods, wanting to apologize, but we ignored her. Eventually, she left us alone and we didn't hear from her for almost a year. On my last day of class before winter break, I walked out of school and was met by an incredibly unwelcome surprise. This is where things got scary. Jess was pacing in the front of the school, biting her fingernails and scratching her head. Her face looked sunken in and she had bags under her eyes. I almost didn't recognize her. I began to cut across the front lawn with my friend Liz to avoid her, but she saw me and walked as fast as she could in my direction. She outreached her arms for a hug, but I stopped. The first thing she said was, "Aside." I asked her what she was doing there and she laughed quietly. "I wanted to apologize for whatever your brother told you. I'm sick. I know. Please don't talk to me anymore." I started away, knowing my brother was parked waiting for me around the corner. Jess reached out and grabbed my shoulder as I did. I quickly pulled away and said, "I'm serious. Leave us alone. I think you need some help, Jess." She immediately began to cry, but I turned away and left. My brother pulled into the front parking lot of the school and opened his car door for me. "Is that Jess?" He looked through his front mirror. "Yeah, I don't know what she's on, but she's crazy." That night, at around 1 a.m., there was a knock at our door. My dad went to it and looked through the peephole. He said, surprised. What the F? I think it's Jess. Don't open it. I think she's doing substances," my brother said. My mom wanted to call the police, but my brother and my dad said we should just wait until she went away. A few moments later, she tapped on the door harder and more violently. We heard her wailing and yelling, "I hear you, let me in," as she cried. "She has a baseball bat or something," my brother said, coming from his room where he looked out the window. I looked from the den window. She looked like something out of a horror movie. She was wearing a grubby dress, barefooted. Her hair had been cut above her shoulders and was in a wild, halfway in a bun, halfway out mess. She had wiped her makeup down her face like a ghoulish movie character. She looked even thinner than she did in daylight, and she swung a metal baseball bat around as she stumbled about our yard. "I'm calling the police. She must be drunk," my mother said. "No, it's fine. She's just giving a show. She'll leave." We didn't know people actually behaved like this. It was all eerily entertaining for a moment, like watching a true crime show. But just as she had been manically stumbling around, she stopped. She stood still, staring vacantly up towards the, tilting her head side to side, up and down and licking her lips. "What is she on?" my dad asked. Jess began to shift back and forth between laughing and yelling and crying. We all sat down as my brother tried her phone and her mom's phone to try and get her to leave. We sat there and listened to the frightening, animalistic sounds of her outside. But then they stopped. We checked the windows and she was gone. We all sat in silence for a moment, taking in the strange encounter. My father just chuckled and shook his head. My mother shook hers, pitying the girl for being so disturbed, but I was frightened. No one, except perhaps my brother, had seen just how quickly her mental state unraveled, from overprotective nature, to small lies, to pathological lies, to full-blown manic outbreaks. But this was her worst, and we didn't expect anything more to come of it, that she'd fade away from our lives, since now she knew we weren't giving in to her desperation. But in the next 2 years, we learned how wrong we were. After the wintertime incident at our house, Jess stopped coming around. She was still very present, however. Every member of my family endured daily text messages and phone calls. They ranged from apologetic and stable, to incredibly distraught or outraged, cursing and making threats. I remember wanting to sleep the lights on for several months after the incident, afraid that she'd climb the fence of our backyard, and I'd find her standing at my window with the same vacant, crazed look she had that night in our front yard. All four of us eventually decided to have our phone numbers changed and block her from our devices and social media accounts. She still had our home phone number, however. Jess left some of the most frightening and haunting messages I'd ever heard. I can remember standing in my kitchen with my family, my brother playing the messages back for us. One stood out. It showed us just how unstable and potentially dangerous she was. My parents and I had returned from an early morning indoor soccer game in winter. My brother asked us to come into the kitchen because we had to hear the new crazy Jess had become. The first message was about 30 seconds long and received at 12:30 a.m. the night before. Jess sounded mildly angry and demanded that we return the batch of cookies she had brought to a 4th of July party some years ago because she didn't want us to have them anymore. We all exchanged humored glances at how ridiculous of a request it was. My mother turned to leave, amused, but my brother stopped her, saying that that wasn't the crazy part. My brother played the message, received at roughly 3 in the morning that day. We were confused at first because the first 15 seconds was that white noise, the kind you hear when a device plays the sound recording of an empty room, if you know what I'm talking about. But all of a sudden, in a deep, animalistic, and enraged voice, she screamed, "Stop playing with me, you're gonna get it," and abruptly ended the call. We were all startled by this. "I want to call the police. They need to know. That girl isn't all there and who knows what she can do." My dad decided that if anything physically happened again, we'd file a report with the police, but that they were just phone calls. My brother assured that she was all talk and wouldn't come around again. At this point, I agreed with my mother. I no longer felt safe. I had never been around someone who behaved like this. I was constantly anxious and I had no idea what I'd do if she came around again. I felt like I was stuck in a Lifetime movie because I didn't think that things like this happened, that someone I knew so personally could be hiding such a deeply withheld, violent, and manic side. It had always been there, but we set it in motion. After disconnecting the landline, the personal phone calls stopped. We didn't hear from her ourselves, but some of the friends my brother shared with Jess would come to him, saying that Jess wanted to speak with him and that she would call and message them regularly wanting his phone number. Luckily, none of them gave it. Just before summer, Jess disappeared. No one got any messages. No one saw her in town. Nothing until my brother received an email from Jess's father, who my brother continued to speak to occasionally. She informed my brother that Jess's family had moved her to the East Coast to undergo treatment for a substance habit. Jess's father had given us more information about the mental state of his daughter. Her father had not spoken to or seen Jess much during the time she unraveled, when she came to our house, or when she'd made the phone calls. Jess's father had been under the impression my brother was still in a healthy relationship with Jess and only learned about their breakup and the incidents following it. He explained that his daughter had always been a white liar, making up stories that didn't make sense, blaming others for things she had already been caught for, arguing the truth of things that were already proven facts. I'd don't think she ever thought that anything she did was wrong, even when it was. I don't understand it, because she was not raised that way, he had explained to my brother. Jess's issues were something that had always been present, but settled comfortably beneath an intelligent and attractive exterior. She'd fooled us, and maybe even herself. Without Jess to worry about, our lives seemed to go back to normal. I still looked over my shoulder every now and again. My brother was beginning a new career and dating a new girl, the daughter of a close family friend who he'd grown up with. Jess started to fade away from our minds, for a while, and then I started noticing a car quite a bit. You know that car you see repeatedly around the area you live in a lot? In the same car I had been seeing for the past month and a half. Valp, just as crazy as ever, my dad said as he started the car. We may need to call the police. We lived a short distance from the school, but I was shaken up and wanted my dad to drive as fast as possible. Every headlight we saw chilled me. I stared at my phone trying not to look out the window. I nearly dropped it. We reached a street convergence in our neighborhood. At the stop sign to the right of us was her car. Dad, that's her. He drove straight and she turned the same direction. Dad, she's following us. I had never felt quite so panicked. Call the police, please, my dad said to my mother, his voice as level as ever. I stared out the back window, ducking low in my seat. My dad turned down another street and she followed again. I'm gonna go in a circle to see if she follows us, okay? My dad said. I was crying at this point as I came to a realization. For 4 more turns, my mom spoke to a 911 operator, unable to accurately name streets, as they were not lit and it was pitch black outside. I laid across the back seat listening to my parents yell at each other, frustrated and I'm sure frightened. And my dad cursed as she continued to follow more closely. The car was flooded with light as she turned on her brights, the grill of her car almost touching our bumper. My dad turned to mirror away to keep the light out of his eyes and sped the car up. Eventually, the light was gone and I could no longer hear the drone of her engine behind us. She was gone. We got home 10 minutes later and turned every light in our house on. My dad checked every closet in our back and side yards, carrying his firearm with him. She's been watching me and your brother. I was almost hysterical in my realization. For the past month, Jess had been stalking both my brother and I, seeing that car had not been a coincidence. She knew what we were both doing. She came to my school function. On both nights my family was there, maybe all 3 nights. She knew where I was. She had followed me all over town. She'd been around our neighborhood and had been her lurking around my workplace. All of a sudden, the threats became real. Jess was no longer afraid of crossing boundaries, if she ever had been. We were now in the middle of a full-blown nightmare. My family was no longer safe. She had gone away to cure one disease, but returned having fed and grown another. Despite the terror of that night, this was only halfway year 5 of 6 and things would continue to approach a boiling point. After we told my brother about what Jess had done the night after my show, he finally began to confide in me the details of his relationship with Jess. She had come to his high school during their senior year. She immediately caught the attention of my brother and his friends as she was beautiful and expected to be reserved as a new student. However, my brother recalled his female friends saying she was aggressive in trying to make friends and liked to talk about how her family had moved here from an affluent community in Texas, so elite that it didn't have a name. Many of his friends also had gotten strange vibes from her and pinned her as a weird snobby girl right away. My brother met her again a few years later when she came into where he was working at the time and said how she had seemed to mature vastly. He took her on one date and almost immediately she wanted to officiate their relationship. He thought it was a bit forward, but didn't hesitate because she impressed him with her elegant way of speaking, kind words, and pretty face. However, he noticed red flags only a few weeks into their relationship. Jess was very insecure, constantly asking my brother if he still had feelings for her, if he was angry with her, and if he thought she was attractive enough. Eventually, this insecurity took a different shape. Jess would send my brother unsolicited pictures of herself in the middle of the day attached to messages asking if he still liked the way her body looked. If my brother went a period of time in their conversations without calling her beautiful or telling her how nice she looked, Jess would point this out. If he protested in any way, she'd become emotional and claim he didn't love her anymore. This behavior mellowed until the end of the second year of their relationship. This is when the narcissism became apparent. Jess would often talk lowly of my brother's previous girlfriends and female friends, boasting about how much more attractive she was than them. Jess refused to attend several of the events my brother asked her to go to, like my birthday dinner or our aunt's funeral, because she wouldn't know anyone and would have no one to talk to. She also enjoyed referring to herself as a princess and wanting to constantly be doted upon. She often argued with my brother about him spending time with his friends without her because she didn't understand why he wanted to be around anyone but her. She was 100% convinced she would one day be a celebrity and marry my brother. However, anytime my brother hinted at wanting to end the relationship, Jess would fly off the handle, becoming belligerent and promising to end herself. My brother was trapped by the fear of her hurting herself. He'd often thought that she was simply bluffing and wouldn't actually do anything, but one day he discovered several bottles of prescription pills in Jess's home. He asked her about them, and she told him that they were antidepressants prescribed to her after the death of her brother, a brother who he later found out never existed. Eventually, Jess began to become angry when my brother would want to spend time with his family without her around. He also told me that Jess fixated a lot of that anger on me. She made theories about how my mother must have had an affair of which I was the product because I was so ugly and my brother was not. So my brother decided it was time to end it no matter what. This information troubled me, as all of her actions following that, asking me to spend time with her, she wanting to be my friend, showing up at my school, and the phone calls, seemed heinous, ill-intended, and even more psychotic than they had been at the time. But for the final year and a half of our ordeal with Jess, psychotic could not begin to explain what she did to us. I slept little in the weeks following the car incident. My brother, who lived across town, visited and called more regularly. I suspected he felt as uneasy as I did. The nights I did sleep, I often sweat through nightmares of girls with axes or gowned women standing at the foot of my bed or in my window. One night in early December, it was a rainy and particularly windy night. I wanted to let the cold air in, and I thought that the sound of rain would help me sleep, so I cracked the window only enough to where it could reach the second latch. I also placed the piece of wood my father had cut to help with security behind the window. I pulled my curtain in front of window, leaving the cracked part of window uncovered to allow air to pass the heavy blackout curtain. I remember waking from sleep, vaguely hearing a foreign noise against the roof out my window. My room was on the second floor of our house. Our house had 3 levels, and the second story was only 6 or 7 steps up from the primary floor of our house. All of the spaces were different levels, but the bedrooms were the highest, slightly lower than they'd be in a classic 2-story home. What I'm getting at is that my room was hard to get to from the outside, but not if you were aware of the parts of our home and the access points from other roof levels over the living room and garage. I shook the noise off, as it was storming, and I thought maybe some leaves or branches were moving around. I turned over to face the wall opposite my window. Not even a second later, my room was illuminated by a surge of white light. I shot up in bed. I was momentarily paralyzed with horror. Every one of my limbs felt as if they were floating as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Then, again, myself and every item in my room became a black silhouette as another flash filled the space. I threw the blankets off of me and ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I was screaming so loud I surprised myself. I ran into my dad as he threw open his bedroom door. He was panicked and held me by my shoulders in the doorway to their bedroom and yelled at me to tell him what was wrong. Someone was taking pictures of me through my window. The roof and house was checked and they, of course, found nothing and no one. My mother sat up with me and asked every basic question a parent asks. Were you dreaming? Are you sure it wasn't lightning? There was no thunder, and I was sure that there had not been at the time it happened. The flashes did not have the same hue as lightning did. I had taken enough cell phone pictures in my life to identify the flash of a camera. I don't know if they believed me then, but I would eventually have proof that would astonish them. My brother adopted Ike a month later. Ike was a 2-month-old Chesapeake Bay Retriever with 1 gold eye and 1 green eye. He had a very distinct white marking on his chest that looked like an hourglass and a white sock on his front left paw. Ike was the love of my brother's life, aside from his now fiancée Kara. Ike would end our torment just 3 months later. The holidays and my brother's engagement to Kara, who was amazing, beautiful, and whose family we had known all our lives, had lifted my family's spirits immensely. My brother was starting his family, almost done with the police academy, and seemed untouchable by any memory of Jess. We felt optimistic for the first time in a long time. Jess hadn't been around, to our knowing, in several weeks. All was normal and things were looking up. But that, again, didn't last. A month or so after bringing him home, after letting him into the backyard for a few minutes by himself, Kara told us that Ike had escaped from the yard. She panicked and ran around the neighborhood looking for him. She got in her car, called me upset, and drove around the block looking for him. She picked me up and I helped her look in the creek area behind where my brother's house was. We couldn't find him. However, when we arrived back at my brother's house, Ike was sitting on the front porch. We were relieved as he was unharmed and seemed to be as happy as ever, despite missing his collar. I helped Kara check the yard for ways he could have gotten out. We both decided he must have shimmied through a small gap in the gate on the side yard. I couldn't help being confused to find no grass or burrs in his fur. We thought nothing of it. A few weeks later, both my brother and Kara were going on a weekend trip with some friends, and I offered to take care of Ike. They dropped him off on the Friday before the 3-day weekend. Ike was happy to play with our older lab, Des. The second night he was with us, I was out with friends, and my dad had let both the dogs into the yard at around 8 p.m. He sat in his chair in the living room watching a show with my mom. They say they remember hearing Des barking because he yelled for him to be quiet, but they assumed the puppy was riling him up. A few minutes later, Des came to the door to be let in. He ran inside and barked at my dad. My dad was confused, as our dog was not a regular barker. He called for Ike, but he didn't come. My dad went out and looked around in the bushes and still did not find him. He became concerned and hurried into the house to get a light. He checked the swimming pool and still did not find him. My mother joined him and they both scoured the large yard but did not find him. When I got home, they had just finished searching the front and side yards. I told them that he had escaped once before, so we decided to take the car to look for him. As we drove around yelling for him, attracting the help of a few neighbors, I thought how strange it was that such well-behaved puppy had suddenly become a master escape artist in the past 3 or so weeks. Our yard had seen 3 or so dogs grow up in it, some younger and smaller than Ike, and we had never had that problem. The fences were high and well built, and my dad had replaced the ones on the side of the house just a few summers ago. We did not find him. I hoped that he'd return that night, like he did last time, but he didn't. I informed my brother on Sunday and proceeded to look all day in surrounding areas, the pound, shelters, vet clinics, and even looked to the sides of roads from bodies. We found nothing. My brother was heartbroken. I helped him make flyers to post in our neighborhood and his. A couple weeks passed and we heard nothing. My dad was doing yard work in mid-February. He came in after a few hours and he set something on the kitchen table. "What's that?" I nipped my brow as I saw it. "It's Ike's collar. It was in the front yard. I almost hit it with a mower. You'll have to take it to your brother." It was Ike's collar, his first collar, not the one he had been wearing the night he went missing from our yard. It was his puppy collar, which he had lost the day he got out of the yard at my brother's house. I called Kara and asked her if they had found it, and she said they hadn't and had bought him a new one. That's when it clicked. Someone had stolen my brother's dog not once, but twice. I told my brother, Kara, and my parents my theory, and it was not a difficult one for them to understand. It had to be connected to everything else. Right when we thought she was out of our lives, we decided to take it to the police to add to our case file on Jess. I also told them about the night I had been photographed from my window. The police, like many times before, told us they could not do anything, as there was no proof she had done any of these things. Frustrated, defeated, and frightened again. But a few short weeks later, in April of 2016, new developments would finally end it all. By complete God-sent coincidence, Kara was with her mother in a small town 45 minutes away from ours. We were planning for my 17th birthday that month, and so preoccupied we almost put Jess, and the fact that she undoubtedly had been watching us for months and had stolen, probably ended, my brother's puppy and thrown his collar in our front yard to help us connect the dots and give her credit for the crime. However, while Kara window shopped in the center of the town, she and her mother noticed a car parked on the street, a car with a puppy in it. It was a bit warm out, so they walked to the window and peeked in at the animal. Kara immediately recognized him by his eyes, and the marking on his chest, and the fact that he began crying as soon as she called his name and he saw her. She phoned the police, phoned my brother, and sat on the back trunk of the car. The police arrived as the owner of the car came back to it. The girl was immediately upset by the presence of the police and Kara's angry accusations. The girl was not Jess, and she became rather helpful. The girl said that she had purchased the dog only a few days ago from an ad online. She told police that the girl she purchased her from was super shady and eager to get rid of the dog, who was skinny and at a very cheap price. The girl who had sold her the dog claimed that she didn't want the stupid dog. It was a present from her boyfriend, but it was the wrong kind. Jess had always liked small dogs. She told the police that she had met the girl to purchase the dog at an apartment complex a few minutes from where they were, but that she wasn't sure what apartment the girl lived in. The police, after Kara had informed them of our situation, used Jess's name to find out that she indeed lived in the apartment complex with 2 roommates. They interviewed Jess's roommates the next day, but Jess was not there. They told detectives that they almost never saw Jess. Her room was always locked and she was almost always gone. She didn't have a job, though she claimed to have one, and her mother was there a lot, checking up on her and dropping off her rent to them. However, when they did speak to her, she talked a lot about her past relationship and switched between how much she loved him and his family to how they all deserved to die and were going to hell. With the information given by the girl who had purchased Ike and by Jess's roommates, the police finally had sufficient evidence to search Jess's apartment. I don't know much about what they found, but what I do know horrified my family and horrified me. On Jess's computer, they found hundreds upon hundreds of pictures of my brother, my parents, Kara, and of me, our cars, our houses, my school, my brother's school, and Ike. Pictures taken through our windows at night, picture of us sleeping, photos taken from our social media of vacations, the picture of my brother's proposal to Kara. She had even doctored herself into some of them. She still had pictures of her and my brother and her with my family up around her room. She had kept Ike in her closet for weeks on a towel, and with just water and little food. The police now had sufficient evidence to arrest Jess. Jess had been obsessively stalking my family for years. She had stalked us from her car, following us around town. It had been her snapping photos of me from the roof outside my window. She had watched my brother drop Ike off at our house. She had documented her opinions of us, our habits, and her plans in a journal which we will not get to see until the case is taken to trial next month. My brother, myself, my father, the girl we found Ike with, Jess's roommates, several of my brother's friends, and Jess's mother will testify against her. It will be the first face-to-face interaction any of us will have had with her in many months, and I am terrified.